Speaker is Dr. Avinash Pathengay, who is going to be elaborating on one more aspect of optic disc involvement, that is uveitis with optic disc. On to you, Doctor.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Chitra, again for giving the opportunity. Hope my slides are visible.
Yes.
Right. So we know that the disc can may get inflamed in anterior uveitis, intermediate uveitis, posterior uveitis, and also in scleritis. So having understood the fundamental about the involvement of the disc, which may happen few times, my talk is framed on 10 questions which would help us to understand the disc involvement in uveitis. So I have framed 10 questions which would help us to take back some solid take-home message clinical pearls. The first one is, if there's a disc infiltrate with multifocal choroiditis, how can we clinically identify a possible etiology? Now, there are two important differentials we have, whether it could be due to tuberculosis or sarcoidosis, especially when a patient presents with multifocal choroiditis. And fortunately, for both of them, there's a triad which would help us to make a diagnosis on clinical evaluation. And most of this happens to be in the posterior segment down and anterior segment evaluation. So the triad for tuberculosis being subvascular pigmentation and the focal kinking of vessels, what you can see here, and the reactivation within the scar. So if any of these you are able to see along with an infiltration of the disc, most probably we are looking at a possibility of a tuberculosis involvement. So having spoken about the triad by which we can make a clinical diagnosis of tuberculosis, so in sarcoidosis, the triad, apart from infiltration of the optic nerve head, they have this candle wax stripping, and third is the inferior retinal involvement. For reasons still not very clear, the inferior hemisphere of the retina is more involved in sarcoidosis than superiorly. So that is one of the giveaways for us to make a clinical diagnosis of sarcoidosis. So having spoken about TB and sarcoidosis, another important point which would help us to make a diagnosis of tuberculosis. So very often we do understand that if there is an reactivation adjacent to a scar, the thought process takes us directly towards toxoplasmosis. But it need not be toxoplasmosis all the time, especially when you have a picture like this. You can see the overlying retinal vessels very clear. So that means we are not looking like a full thickness retinitis. So it is an involvement involving, it's an infection which is primarily involving the choroidal level and maybe the outer retina as well. So if we have to have a clinical reasoning with an analytical thought process attached to it in this particular patient, so pigmented scar with a subretinal lesion adjacent to the scar and with overlying retinal hemorrhages, and on OCT you can see the elevation of the retinal pigment choriocapillary complex with the disorganization of the retina, and third, in this patient, the MAN2 was positive. So rightly so, we made a diagnosis of possible etiology of tuberculosis. We started the patient on anti-tuberculosis treatment, and the proof of concept is the resolution, what you can see in the right. So sometimes clinical reasoning would, with the clinical features, what with patients present with helps us to find the etiology and makes it easier. So what would be our approach in a disc which is involved in a HIV patient, especially with toxoplasmosis or even any other infection which happens? So never forget to get a neuroimaging in these patients. And we all know that steroids have to be used judiciously, and especially with optic nerve involvement, be very cautious. And a word of advice is, if there is an infection which is involving the optic nerve head, even in HIV patients, intravitreal treatment alone would not be sufficient. A systemic antimicrobial therapy is very important in these patients. So having spoken about tuberculosis, sarcoidosis, and toxoplasmosis, I would just like to re-emphasize point which my teacher has already made previously, that if you get patients with leukemia with an infiltration of the optic disc, two important points we have to consider, that it's a possibility of recurrence and the prognosis not be great in such patients. So the fifth question is about an rare entity, and this should have in people's mind, especially when one gets to see a patient with unilateral retinitis pigmentosa like picture. It's very rare to see unilateral retinitis pigmentosa, but if you get to see one, do not forget to rule out this disease of DUSN, diffuse unilateral subacute neuroretinitis. And one easy way to differentiate between DUSN and unilateral retinitis pigmentosa is electroretinogram, full field ERG is rarely extinguished in DUSN compared to patient with unilateral retinitis pigmentosa. And the sixth point which I have to make is the conventional teaching is whenever people come across an arthritic type of ischemic optic neuropathy, our mind drifts towards giant cell arteritis. Is this all the time? Not. It may not be the case. We can even have an younger patient who can present with ischemic or arthritic type of ischemic optic neuropathy. And rightly so in a patient who have SLE and they have an optic nerve involvement, they can still present with arthritic type of ischemic optic neuropathy. And even in patients with acute retinal necrosis, where the patient, when it presents with optic neuropathy, the chance of an ischemic component here, it's because of infection, ischemic vasculitis because of the herpetic virus is also pretty high. So the concept of arthritic ischemic optic neuropathy limited to giant cell arteritis may not be true all the time. So having spoken about arthritic ischemic optic neuropathy, let me drift away to an uncommon white dot syndrome, where it is characterized by hyperfluorescence right from the beginning of the fluorescein angiogram. And you can see the spots over the dots, or classically described as wreath-like hyperfluorescence. And what happens in these patients is the disc would leak on fluorescein, but the perifoveal leakage or cystoid macular edema does not happen in these patients. So having spoken about that, it is also important to understand with this composite photograph that this is a self-resolving condition. And most of the times in mutes, the spontaneous resolution starts around second to third week. And if the spontaneous resolution by
Sir, 1 minute remaining.
does not happen, we have to rule out mutes, DUSN in these patients. And patients with DUSN, mutes also have an enlarged blind spot, and which starts gradually decrease in size with the resolution of mutes. So the macular star is a feature which can be seen in neuroretinitis, which can be caused by various etiologies. And the point which I want to make is here also, like in mutes, there is no perifoveal leakage. And for the macular star to happen, it is important that the retinal architecture is intact. So if the retinal architecture is intact, it's unlikely a patient would develop a macular star in these patients. So my penultimate question is, what causes peripapillary fibrosis? So this can be confused with disc edema sometimes, and peripapillary fibrosis is a sequelae of severe multifocal choroiditis, or even like conditions like VKH, or can be a telltale sign of
so your time is up.
CNVM. And my last question is, how does inflammatory CNVM differ from other causes? So it requires lesser number of anti-VEGF injections. There is a higher, quicker rate of resolution, and when it resolves with perifibrosis. And sometimes an co-administration of steroid may be required if there is an associated inflammatory, acute inflammation in such kind of patients. So with that, I end my 10 questions, and I'm ready to take any questions or doubts. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Those 10 questions of yours answered all the questions which I had piled up for you. But I'm going to ask a very basic question. Why is it that the optic disc nerve head vascular plexus so sensitive to fluctuations in blood sugar and blood pressure? Can anyone answer this?
Okay, now if you look at, to a certain extent, it depends upon the blood retinal barrier also. So autoregulation also in these patients, especially when you're looking at hypertension. So retinal vessels have autoregulation. The choroidal vessels does not have autoregulation. But when you look at the disc, it is supplied by both the retinal vessels and the choroidal vessels also. So there is an incomplete autoregulation which happens at the optic nerve head. That's the reason why in patients with accelerated hypertension, the patient can get disc edema. But it is also important that when a patient gets disc edema and accelerated hypertension, because of the autoregulation which gets distorted in these patients, never allow the blood pressure to drop suddenly, which can happen, and that can progress to ischemic optic neuropathy.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mike, would you have anything to add to this?
No, I don't think I do to this one. That was excellent, and I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Dr. Mahesh, you have anything to add?
Not really, Dr. Chitra, because I cannot. Uveitis is his forte.
Yeah, and he seems to have covered it all. Very
Dr.
nice.
Avinash, Dr.
Yeah.
Avinash, excellent presentation as usual. Just a point on the DUSN versus unilateral RP. Like in absence of ARG, clinically, if there is a clear zone between the peripheral pigmentary changes and the macular involvement, like atrophic maculopathy, that's an indicator of a congenital disease rather than DUSN. DUSN will not respect, I mean, there would be no lucid zone between the peripheral and macular changes in DUSN.
It depends on how much of retina getting involved and how these worms travel actually. And sometimes we have also seen very interesting only inferior hemisphere getting involved than the superior ones. It all depends on how the worm is traveling.
There can be a localized limited involvement, but if the worm has traveled the macula to the macula, there would be a track or some changes like connecting the peripheral and macular changes.
That depends again on how big the worm is. If the worm is very small, sometimes you will not be able to see one. The bigger ones, yes, you can see these tracks going all over.
Okay. Thank you very much.